Alfred Jodl, a name not as well known as Adolf Hitler or Heinrich Himmler, yet crucial to the operations of Nazi Germany. A top military officer and one of Hitler's closest confidants, Jodl was an instrumental figure in planning Germany's aggressive military campaigns across Europe during World War II. His life reflects the complexities of loyalty, duty, and ultimately the consequences of serving a brutal regime. Born on May 10, 1890, in Würzburg, Germany, Alfred Joseph Ferdinand Jodl came from a family with a long history of military service. Raised with a sense of duty to his country, he grew up during a time of German militarism and nationalism. Like many young men of his generation, Jodl found himself drawn to the army and the ideals of discipline, honor, and patriotism that it symbolized. At 19, he joined the Bavarian army and proved to be a dedicated strategic soldier. He served in World War I, where he first witnessed the horrors of modern warfare, but also developed a reputation for his intelligence and ability to strategize under pressure. By the war's end in 1918, Jodl had emerged as an officer who saw the military as his calling. In the post-war years, he remained in Germany's army, the Reichswehr, where he focused on honing his tactical skills and further developing his reputation. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, he quickly transformed the German military into a tool for his expansionist vision. The Treaty of Versailles had limited Germany's military capacity, but Hitler was determined to ignore these restrictions. By rebuilding the army, he paved the way for the Nazi Party's aggressive territorial ambitions. Jodl's career flourished under this new militarized regime. In 1935, he was appointed to the Wehrmacht, the unified armed forces of Nazi Germany. Though Jodl claimed later that he initially had reservations about Hitler, he became one of the Führer's most reliable officers, deeply involved in planning military operations. When World War II broke out in 1939, Jodl was chief of operations for the High Command of the Armed Forces. His strategic insight contributed to the rapid success of Germany's early invasions. Jodl was pivotal in planning the Blitzkrieg, or lightning war tactic, used against Poland, and later the 1940 invasion of France. This tactic of swift, overwhelming force allowed Germany to claim large swaths of territory at an alarming rate, shocking the world with its effectiveness. Throughout these campaigns, Jodl worked closely with Hitler and Wilhelm Keitel, the head of the OKW. Hitler trusted Jodl, valuing his unflinching loyalty and strategic mind. As Germany conquered country after country, Jodl's status rose alongside the regime's success. Yet this trust came at a price. Jodl became entwined in the unethical orders Hitler issued, including the infamous Commissar Order that called for the execution of Soviet political commissars and prisoners of war. He helped draft and implement these policies, which explicitly violated the conventions of warfare. In June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, marked a turning point in Jodl's career and in the fate of Nazi Germany. Jodl was one of the architects of this invasion, confident that it would yield another swift victory. However, the Soviet Union proved to be far more resilient than anticipated. As German forces advanced, they faced brutal winter conditions, fierce Soviet resistance, and overstretched supply lines. Jodl and his colleagues in the High Command underestimated the Soviet ability to fight back. This miscalculation would prove disastrous, as German forces suffered catastrophic losses. By 1943, Germany was losing ground on both the eastern and western fronts. Despite this, Jodl remained staunchly loyal to Hitler. He was present at numerous military briefings where Hitler demanded increasingly desperate measures, and Jodl complied with these orders. He authorized the defensive lines, the scorched earth policies, and other brutal tactics that inflicted tremendous suffering on civilians and soldiers alike. Hitler's closest advisors were beginning to lose faith in the war's outcome, but Jodl remained steadfast, unwavering in his duty to the Führer. When a group of officers plotted to assassinate Hitler in July 1944, Jodl was not involved. He remained loyal, further binding himself to the Nazi cause, even as it became clear Germany was facing defeat. By 1945, Germany was in ruins. The Allies were closing in, and Hitler had retreated to his bunker in Berlin. On May 7, 1945, Jodl, acting on behalf of the German High Command, signed the unconditional surrender of Germany in Reims, France, officially ending World War II in Europe. Jodl's signing of the surrender document was a symbolic moment. It marked the collapse of the Third Reich and the end of a regime that had caused unprecedented destruction across Europe. Despite his actions to end the war, Jodl would not escape accountability. After the surrender of Nazi Germany, Alfred Jodl was captured by Allied forces and, alongside other top Nazi officials, brought to trial in what would become one of the most famous war crimes tribunals in history, the Nuremberg trials. These trials, held by the Allied powers in 1945 and 1946, sought to hold Nazi leaders accountable for the atrocities committed during the war. Jodl was among 24 prominent leaders of the Third Reich, charged with war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace. As chief of operations for the Wehrmacht, Jodl was accused of playing a central role in orchestrating Germany's aggressive military campaigns and enforcing orders that resulted in widespread suffering. Unlike some of his co-defendants, Jodl had never been an official member of the Nazi Party. He saw himself as a soldier who followed orders, a man of military duty rather than political ideology. But the charges he faced went far beyond simple military obedience. The prosecutors built their case against Jodl meticulously, emphasizing his role in planning and executing strategies that led to the death and suffering of millions. They charged him with 4 main counts: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning and waging wars of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The evidence brought forward painted a damning picture of Jodl's involvement in decisions that violated the laws of war and contributed to the Nazi regime's brutal agenda. Among the most incriminating pieces of evidence were the so-called criminal orders signed or authorized by Jodl. These included the Commissar Order, which mandated the summary execution of Soviet political commissars taken prisoner, and the Nacht und Nebel, Night and Fog Decree, designed to make opponents of the Reich disappear without a trace. These orders explicitly violated international law and showed a deliberate disregard for human life. The prosecution argued that these actions went far beyond traditional military strategy and reflected a deep complicity in Nazi crimes. Jodl's defense, led by his lawyer, Dr. Hans Laternser, relied on the argument that he was a soldier following the chain of command. He claimed that he acted under the oath he had sworn to Hitler and that refusing to follow orders would have meant his own death, as well as severe consequences for his family. His defense team argued that Jodl was not a Nazi ideologue, but a career officer who had a duty to obey his superiors. Jodl made the following statement: "I am guilty of having served as a soldier in my country's army, but I deny the accusation of being complicit in war crimes. I acted as any soldier would under command." Jodl's argument raised a critical question that would echo throughout history. Where does the line between duty and morality lie? His defense claimed that as a military officer, he was bound by oath to follow commands, and the political objectives of the Nazi Party were outside his purview. He maintained that he saw himself as a professional soldier carrying out operations rather than a perpetrator of ideological terror. However, the prosecution contended that Jodl had opportunities to refuse, resist, or at least voice objections to these orders. His intelligence and senior position within the Wehrmacht, they argued, meant he was fully aware of the moral implications of his actions. They pointed to instances where other officers had shown dissent or resigned from their posts rather than support such orders. Jodl, by contrast, had not only followed, but actively enforced these criminal directives. Survivors and witnesses provided haunting testimony that vividly illustrated the consequences of the orders Jodl had signed. They described mass executions, starvation, forced labor, and the horror of occupied territories stripped of resources. While Jodl sat in the courtroom listening to these accounts, he maintained a cold, impassive expression, occasionally casting a glance at his co-defendants. His demeanor was widely interpreted as indifferent or detached, further cementing his image as an officer unshaken by the human impact of his actions. The prosecution's final argument focused on Jodl's complicity in creating and enforcing a culture of brutality that permeated the Wehrmacht. He was described as a man who, while not a Nazi ideologue, willingly aligned himself with Hitler's vision, doing so with full knowledge of the atrocities his orders caused. The closing statements delivered a damning summation. Jodl's role, they argued, was indispensable in executing a war that aimed to eradicate entire populations and expand the reach of Nazi tyranny. In October 1946, after weeks of testimonies and deliberation, the tribunal found Alfred Jodl guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death by hanging. The court's decision was significant, as it signaled that following orders was no longer a viable defense for actions that violated international laws and human rights. The judges held that military leaders had a moral obligation that transcended their allegiance to their commanders, especially when those commands led to crimes against humanity. Jodl's response to the verdict was described as stoic. Until the end, he maintained that he had been a soldier doing his duty, refusing to accept personal responsibility for the wider devastation wrought by his orders. His execution would take place on October 16, 1946, alongside several other top Nazi officials. His final words reportedly included a last, unyielding statement of his innocence. The Nuremberg trials established a new precedent in international law, asserting that individuals, and not just nations, could be held accountable for crimes against peace and humanity. Alfred Jodl's trial became a focal point for this principle, illustrating the shift from a defense of duty and obedience to an emphasis on personal responsibility. The trial of Alfred Jodl challenged the notion that following orders absolves one of moral responsibility. His conviction underscored the emerging global consensus that leaders and military officers must be held accountable for their actions, no matter the orders they receive. The legacy of Jodl's trial remains an enduring lesson in the importance of ethics over blind obedience. After weeks of legal proceedings, Alfred Jodl's fate was sealed. On October 16, 1946, he, along with other prominent figures of the Nazi regime, awaited his execution. As he spent his final hours alone in his cell, there were no signs of the unshakable loyalty he had once shown Hitler and the Nazi cause. Now he was a solitary figure awaiting judgment for actions that would define his legacy. At dawn, Jodl was led from his cell to the gallows in the gymnasium of the Nuremberg prison. British hangman Albert Pierrepoint, who was tasked with the executions of the Nazi war criminals, noted Jodl's calm demeanor and remarked on his stoicism. Jodl approached the gallows without a struggle, his face an expression of pride and defiance until the very end. He maintained that he had been acting in the service of his country, clinging to his belief that his actions were justified as military duty. Before his execution, Jodl's final words were reported as, "I salute you, my Germany." He maintained his innocence to the end, continuing to distance himself from the ideology he had once fervently served. With those words, Alfred Jodl's life ended, a symbolic closing of the chapter on Germany's military leadership under Hitler. As the noose tightened, Jodl's story reached a close, but the implications of his trial and execution would ripple through history. The Nuremberg trials were the first of their kind, a public, international tribunal holding high-ranking officials accountable not only for their direct actions, but for their complicity in the atrocities committed under their command. This trial set a precedent for prosecuting crimes against humanity, establishing that following orders would no longer serve as a defense for those who enabled mass violence and terror. The execution of Alfred Jodl, along with other key figures of the Nazi regime, marked the beginning of a new era in international law. The principles of the Nuremberg trials would echo across generations, shaping how the world approached the concepts of war crimes and individual responsibility. The trial set a clear message. Regardless of rank or position, individuals would be held accountable for crimes against humanity. Jodl's case in particular highlighted a shift in understanding the role of military obedience. His defense, based on loyalty, duty, and the demands of a soldier's oath, was deemed insufficient in the face of overwhelming evidence of moral atrocities. His willingness to implement orders like the Commissar Order and the scorched earth policies in the Soviet Union demonstrated how obedience, when left unchecked, could become complicity and horror. In Germany today, the story of Alfred Jodl is remembered as part of the nation's reflection on the Holocaust and World War II. His life and actions serve as a reminder of the dangers of blind loyalty to a leader, particularly when that leader's vision disregards human life and dignity. For historians, Jodl's career offers a study in how an intelligent, disciplined man could become deeply embedded in a system that was fundamentally inhumane. The legacy of Alfred Jodl lives on as a cautionary tale about the perils of nationalism and militarism, unchecked by ethical considerations. His story poses critical questions. Can loyalty justify any action? What are the moral limits of obedience? These questions remain relevant in today's world as governments and militaries continue to face the challenges of balancing duty with moral responsibility. The Nuremberg trials and Jodl's role within them laid the groundwork for international standards that are still in place today. The United Nations would go on to establish the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, just 2 years after Jodl's execution, setting forth global principles that recognize the inherent rights of all people. The precedents set at Nuremberg influenced the formation of the International Criminal Court and shaped human rights laws worldwide, sending a clear message that individuals could be tried for crimes against humanity, genocide, and war crimes even decades after they occurred. While Jodl's life is often viewed as a tragic story of misguided loyalty, his downfall serves as a stark warning of what can happen when moral judgment is abandoned for the sake of authority. The legacy of the Nuremberg trials challenges each generation to confront these issues, reminding us of the responsibility every individual holds to uphold humanity and ethics, regardless of orders or oaths. Alfred Jodl's life and legacy leave us with a lesson on the heavy cost of blind allegiance. The history of his rise and fall, his conviction and execution, stand as enduring reminders that the rule of law and human rights must remain paramount, even in times of war. His story urges us to never forget the price of ignoring ethical boundaries in pursuit of power, and it calls on us to remember the countless lives that were affected by choices he justified in the name of duty. His final salute to Germany was one of defiance, but the legacy he left behind is a warning that echoes beyond borders, across decades into our own time. Thank you for joining us in explaining this important moment in history. If you found this video insightful, please like, share, and subscribe for more content on history. Remember, the lessons of the past must not be forgotten.